Hi, everybody. We're back to Chapter 2 in Of Mice and Men. We're starting off about page 24. Yes, about page 24. Yep. George and Lenny had just met the boss, and we realized that George told a bunch of lies to the boss. And then, Lenny here confronts him about the lies. I wasn't kicked in the head with no horse, was I, George? And if he says, and you said I was your cousin, well, totally not related. And the next thing we know, the old man, the swamper, Candy, comes walking into the room. Now, you can ask yourself, is this guy, did he really eavesdrop? And there's a clue later on that, yes, he did eavesdrop. Okay, and we have a couple of other little clues that come in. He says, I wasn't listening. I have no idea what you're talking about. I don't want to be in your business. And then he looks uneasily from George to Lenny and then back. Okay, he doesn't know these guys. They just come into the bunkhouse. He's looking at George to Lenny. Okay, he's probably realized George is the smart one out of this pairing, but Lenny's got all the strength. And if he's heard the whole conversation all along, well, he's heard the stuff that George has said about him being strong. So when he looks from George to Lenny, he's thinking, I don't want to get messing around with these guys. So I'm going to tell them what they want to hear. I hear nothing. I have no idea what you're talking about. Okay. And then, Candy and his old dog come in, talk a little bit about the dog. Wonder what that dog's purpose is on the ranch. Dog's purpose. Y'all read that. Anyway, then we have another character come running in. And this guy he's a young man, brown face, brown eyes, head of tightly curled hair. Wears a work glove on his left hand and, like the boss, wore the high-heeled boots. So again, Steinbeck is showing us, instead of telling us, that this guy is not a laboring man. So we know that he's somebody somewhat in charge. We get his name when the swamper says it. We still don't know the swamper's name. Even though I've told it to you, none of you still know the swamper's name. They haven't said it in the context of the story yet. Okay? All right, so this guy comes in looking for his old man, and then we get this paragraph here. His eyes passed over the new men and stopped. This whole paragraph is about him sizing up George and Lenny. And notice he kind of disregards George. He looks at him, but then he turns to Lenny, and his arms bend, and he gets down in a crouch like a fighting stance. And that word pugnacious, very important for defining Curly. If you're going to pick a vocabulary word to go with any of these characters, pugnacious totally goes with Curly. Totally inclined to fight, quarrelsome, belligerent, combative. Okay? All right, so now Curly picks on Lenny, wants him to talk. George is a bit more aggressive. If you noticed, he was very submissive with the boss, wouldn't look at the boss, very submissive. But then now, he's tense. He's being confrontational with Curly, but he's not being too disrespectful that he'd get kicked off the ranch. Okay, lets Lenny talk. And then, Curly leaves. And then we find out all about Curly, that he's the boss's son, that he's pretty handy, and that he was a boxer. And we get a lot of foreshadowing here. Okay? And we have the swamper telling us all about Curly. And if you notice, the swamper tends to like to talk and likes to tell a lot of different stories and likes to talk about people. Gee, I wonder how he heard about all of that information. Oh yeah, wait a second. Let's go back for a second. And when you take a look here, the old man looked cautiously at the door to make sure no one was listening. That is your clue right there. That the old man was listening during George's rant when he was going off on Lenny about not talking. It's all right there, okay? So that's your clue, because he knows to check the door first. Why? Because he's the one that's been doing the eavesdropping too, okay? So here we go again. Candy starts talking, the swamper starts talking about Curly, gives you a bit of information about him, talks about how Curly always wins, because if he jumps a guy bigger than him, then he looks like he's awesome. He's super strong. But if he jumps a guy bigger than him and the other guy beats him, well, then they say, well, the big guy should have picked on somebody his own size. You know, Curly's got what we call the Napoleon complex, named after, yes, that historical figure. You know, and it gives short guys the bad reputation that they all want to fight, you know, bigger people. Okay. We also get here foreshadowing, with George saying ominously that, you know, Curly better watch out for Lenny. You know, he's not a fighter, but Lenny's strong and quick and doesn't know any rules. This is important for later on, as you will see with foreshadowing, of course. Okay? All right, now they sit down and go start playing cards. It's interesting that George is playing solitaire because, geez, solitaire is a solitary game, and despite being with Lenny, you know, really, it's not a relationship of equals. All right, now we get some more gossip from the Swamper. You know, he talks all about Curly's wife. Notice we still don't get a name. You know, there's no name. She's just known as Curly's wife. You know, think about that. If you were on the ranch and you lived there and nobody bothered to know your name, how would you feel? How would you feel if nobody bothered to get to know you? Okay, we get a little bit of dirty joke there. I'm not going to talk about that, and you can ask your parents. But there's George playing solitaire again. And then we get talking about how Curly's only been married for 2 weeks. Pants is full of ants, and she's given everybody the eye. Now, we already don't like Curly because he's picked on Lenny. We don't like Curly because he's, you know, itching for a fight. We see he's not a nice guy. But then we have this description from the Swamper that she's given everybody the eye, that she's being really flirtatious. Well, think about it. It's the 1930s. She's the only woman on the ranch. There's no Curly's mom. There's no Curly's grandma, Curly's aunt, Curly's sister. It's just her. They don't even bother to get to know her name. And, you know, we don't know the reasons why she married Curly yet. We find out a little bit more about her later on. But you can guess, like, you know, everybody in the 1930s was just trying to look for opportunity and trying to do something better. So maybe she married him knowing that, you know, Curly's the boss's son. They have a ranch. They're stable. Like, you know, it was a place to go to. It was a place that was secure. They didn't have to worry about losing the ranch. I'm just guessing, okay? But, you know, the derogatory comments, though, you know, I don't know if it's necessarily deserved. He calls her a tart, that she's a loose woman. But there's no proof of her sleeping around. Just says that she gives everybody the eye. And what the heck does that mean anyway? She looks at him? She smiles at him? Well, if you want to make friends with somebody, don't you smile at him and look at him? I don't know. I don't know if they're exaggerating here or what. But we then get, you know, it's more foreshadowing here with this, talking about Curly's wife and setting her up for some kind of exchange that's going to happen later on, and we're going to meet her. Okay, so then we get again the old man moving toward the door, okay, checking things out, and he's like, oh, I got to go set out the wash basins and get on out of here. And, you know, and Candy asks for a little bit of reassurance here. You know, you're not going to tell Curly I didn't say anything? And he's like, no. All right, so then, you know, there's a little bit like they've shared a little something, come to an agreement. Candy, the Swamper, and George are going to be friendly. Okay? All right, so we get a little scene change here. You know, just like we did with the clearing, we get a little bit of scene change of description. You know, that we get, Steinbeck is showing us that the grain teams have come back from the field and that the other guys are going to be entering the scene soon. Okay, George continues to play cards. Lenny's just laying down watching him. And we get more foreshadowing. You know, this isn't a setup. I'm scared. You're going to get in trouble. He's going to take a sock at you first chance he gets. This is all foreshadowing. And Lenny's eyes being frightened. I don't want any trouble, George. Don't let him sock me. Okay? Now, look at what George kind of says to him. You know, he says to Lenny, you know, I've seen plenty of guys like this. He always wins. So he tries to give Lenny a coping skill, okay? So he tries to tell him, just avoid it. Just stay away from him. And if you stay away from him, we might be able to make it through this if we avoid it. But I mean, don't we all know what happens when we avoid something? You know, or procrastinate? It always comes back to bite us. So, you know, again, Lenny, you know, I don't want any trouble. I don't want things to go wrong, but we know that this is going to happen because Steinbeck doesn't let up. He just keeps bringing up that Lenny's a fighter and that, or not Lenny's a fighter, that Curly's a fighter. So, you know, you don't want to have nothing to do with him. Well, guess what? Two double negatives there, a double negative there. You don't have nothing to do with him, which means you will have something to do with him. Absolute foreshadowing. All right, we get the more sounds of the men coming back. And if you notice, we don't need to know that. The jingle is sound word. Okay, so that's your onomatopoeia. Okay, and then Lenny asking George, like, you ain't mad, George, are you? And again, still, they're going back to talking about Curly again. Okay, and again, stay away from him. I think you've gotten the point that something's going to happen. They're going to tangle. And notice, though, that Lenny's response is, sure, I will, George. I won't say a word. Well, that's the same thing he said at the clearing. And did he not say a word? No, he spoke when he talked to the boss. So we know it's going to happen. And again, Steinbeck still doesn't let up. And George even tells him, all right, now don't let him pull you in. But if the guy does, sock him. Let him have it. And we get a little bit of comedy here because then Lenny's like, let him have what, George? What am I going to give him? You know, so it's fine. And again, Lenny's, you know, saying, I don't want any trouble. His eyes move sadly to George's face. You know, if I don't get any trouble, you ain't going to let me tend the rabbits. And we have, again, remembering him where they slept down by the river. And that strategy of hiding until somebody comes to you, until George comes to get him. Okay, so all of this here we know. This is all foreshadowing that Steinbeck keeps bringing this stuff up again. We know that there's going to be trouble. Okay, so speaking of trouble, notice now who enters the scene. A girl was standing there looking in. She had full rouged lips, wide-spaced eyes, heavily made up. Who is this? Her fingernails were red. Her hair hung, ooh, look at all that alliteration, in little rolled clusters like sausages. Interesting that Steinbeck uses the word sausage to describe a woman's hair, but those plump kind of curls could also be a little bit of symbolism maybe for later on. She's dressed in a cotton house dress, nice little red mules, little shoes, you know, that are pretty little slip-on shoes. And here she says, I'm looking for Curly. Well, he was here a minute ago, says George. And then she decides, oh, well, Curly's not here now. Well, I'll sit down and talk to him. Okay, now we can take this scene a couple of different ways. You know, she could be flirty. Oh, you guys are the new ones, huh? Now, how does she say this? Does she say it flirty? I mean, Steinbeck doesn't give us anything. You know, just says she puts her hands behind her back and leans against the door frame. Okay, so that shows that she's not going anywhere. Okay, so that her body was thrown forward. Okay, maybe a little provocative there. And then ask, like, oh, you guys are the new ones that come in? All right, and Lenny's checking her out. And we should feel a little bit uncomfortable here. You know, there's definitely something going on. And Lenny's watching her fascinated. Okay, so she says nobody can't blame a person for looking. All right, so maybe there is some truth to what Candy has said about her giving everybody the eye and being flirtatious. You know, and she's not a typical ranch hand's wife with all her fingernails red and her hair done up, you know. She's worried about her appearance. She's fashionable. Really, the ranch probably isn't the place for her. Okay, Slim, we've heard of Slim. He comes walking by, and then Slim says, you know, she says, I'm trying to find Curly, Slim. And he says to her walking by, well, you ain't trying very hard. I seen him going in your house. And then she becomes suddenly apprehensive. Why? Because she's doing something wrong. She says, bye, boys, and hurries away. And then we'll talk about her some more in a minute.